out of the 4 canonical Gospels, which of them came first, and which of them were composed closest to the ministry of Jesus. How were they written, and how does knowing this allow us to understand the Gospels in their own time? Of the 4 canonical Gospels, the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are referred to as the synoptic Gospels. These 3 Gospels have tremendous similarities and an obvious relationship with one another. Due to their literary similarities, dating them becomes much easier by assessing their relationship to one another. For this video, we will focus on the 3 synoptic Gospels and try to understand which came first. As mentioned, the literary relationships between the 3 synoptics are very evident and can be recognized by any reader. To make a brief example, we can look at the baptism of Jesus. Not only does each Gospel record this event of Jesus' baptism, but there is a high level of verbatim agreement, and there are occasions of these textual similarities all throughout the Gospels, and oftentimes for long, unbroken stretches. Their similarities call into question the relationship of the 3, and this observation is popularly known as the synoptic problem. There's been a whole host of solutions to the synoptic problem. We will try to observe some of them in the video today. But put simply, due to the incredible literary similarities, it is clear that one or more of the Gospels has been used as a source document at one point or another, a source that the next author then appropriated into the composition of their own Gospel, hence the verbatim textual agreements. Therefore, the problem at hand is uncovering which Gospels were the source document and which Gospels were then copied from this document. While modern scholarship has had their own answers for the synoptic problem, this problem has been noted by Christians for centuries. Even St. Augustine had something to say about the synoptic problem, realizing Matthew, Mark, and Luke's incredible textual similarities. In his work On the Harmony of the Gospels, St. Augustine proposes that the composition of the Gospels looks something like this. The first Gospel to be written was Matthew, from the view and collection of Matthew the Evangelist. After Matthew, Mark used Matthew as an authoritative source for the composition of his own Gospel. In doing so, being the smallest and most concise of the 3 Gospels, Mark abbreviated Matthew's Gospel while also including his own oral source from St. Peter. After both Matthew and Mark were composed, Luke the Evangelist then composed his Gospel, sourcing from both the established writings of Matthew and Mark. This theory is rightly named the Augustinian hypothesis. Now, stepping into more modern times, in the 1700s, the 2 Gospel hypothesis was popularized by German scholar Johann Jakob Griesbach. This hypothesis would once again place Matthew to be the first Gospel written, but it makes Mark out to be a conflation of both Matthew and Luke. Griesbach also believed that Luke was influenced by the Gospel of Matthew, and thus properly organized, Matthew stands as the first Gospel, followed by Luke, and succeeding both, we have Mark, who took influence from both of his predecessors. But one major problem with both the Augustinian hypothesis and the 2 Gospel hypothesis is their conclusions of Mark. In both cases, due to Mark's shorter and more concise Gospel, Mark has to be considered an abbreviated version of one of the 2 or an abbreviated version of both. And considering Mark to be an abbreviated version is troublesome to say the least. Through the abbreviation of Mark, one must conclude that Mark disregarded the birth and infancy of Jesus, seeing it as insignificant for his Gospel narrative. Moreover, Mark also must have omitted the resurrection of Jesus that we find in both Matthew and Luke, as Mark's Gospel ends with the woman fleeing from the empty tomb. And this is even more troubling as Mark repeatedly records Jesus predicting his resurrection, so why not include the narrative if it is recorded in the sources he uses? But to be fair and present the case as to why Mark might not have included Jesus' infancy, referring back to Griesbach, who supported Mark as an abbreviated version, he conjectured that perhaps Mark wished to focus on Jesus the teacher and skipped over these early narratives. Now, although this is imaginable, many of Luke's infancy narratives are used to highlight Jesus' profound teaching ability manifesting at a young age. For example, in Luke chapter 2, when Jesus was left in the temple, he amazed the scribes with his knowledge and answers at only age 12, showing his superiority to the temple's teachers. Past these 2 very significant omissions, one must also believe that Mark, in the pursuit of abbreviating the 2 preceding Gospels, also removed the famous Sermon on the Mount and an assortment of parables, such as the prodigal son, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the lost sheep. All considered, to take Mark as a gospel somewhere in the mix of the three synoptics, one must explain why Mark felt the need to make an abbreviated version of Matthew or Luke, and in doing so, why Mark omitted significant aspects of Jesus' ministry, including his resurrection narrative and appearance in Galilee. Ultimately, this would lead us to believe that Mark was not influenced by Matthew or Luke, and therefore did not include said tradition. This, of course, would place Mark as the first gospel written, and consequently, both Matthew and Luke must have used Mark as a source document. This understanding of Mark being the original source for the synoptics is what is referred to as Markan Priority. But if both Matthew and Luke made use of Mark, what is the order that follows Mark? Did Matthew write first, followed by Luke, or vice versa? Well, instead of placing the three Gospels in direct succession of one another, a popular modern theory would suggest that Matthew and Luke were composed independently of one another. To illustrate this more clearly, based off the content included in the Synoptic Gospels, we can look at it like this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all share content, such as the baptism narrative we looked at previously. And when they all share this content, it is categorized as triple tradition, as all three Gospels include it. But the location of said content is not always placed in the same order as each other. What is significant about the relocation of Markan episodes is that while Matthew sometimes relates an episode in a different sequence than Mark and Luke, and while Luke sometimes relates an episode in a different sequence than Mark and Matthew, Matthew and Luke never agree in locating an episode differently from Mark's sequence. For example, Mark records the exorcising of a demoniac in chapter 5 of his Gospel, and Matthew places this episode at an entirely new location. But Luke remains in agreement with Mark, and they both follow up this episode with the resurrection of the young girl, unlike Matthew. And as for Luke, we see him relocate the rejection of Jesus at Nazareth. Mark records this episode in the middle of Jesus' ministry in chapter 6, whereas Luke relocates this episode to directly after his temptation in the wilderness and uses this story to kick off Jesus' ministry. Matthew, of course, remains in agreement with Mark, recording Jesus' rejection at Nazareth well into Jesus' ministry. Therefore, although we do see Matthew and Luke sometimes relocate the content found in Mark, they never agree in the relocation. Evidence like this would suggest that both Matthew and Luke utilized Mark, but did so completely independently of each other. Considering this is what the series of composition would look like. Mark being the first gospel, followed by Matthew and Luke, written at a later date, without the influence of one another. But what does this line of composition tell us about the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels? Having Mark as the earliest of the three, and the gospel that was used as a source document for both Matthew and Luke, illustrates an interesting dynamic in the early church. Importantly, we have demonstrated that Matthew and Luke worked independently of each other in copying Mark. Therefore, we have evidence for two distinct and established evangelists in the early church that held Mark to such a high standard that they made great effort to copy it, in most cases verbatim, when including it in their own Gospels. Rather than discrediting both Matthew and Luke for being copies of the originals, I believe it displays Mark as an early authoritative source that was so strongly venerated it could not have been left out when composing a more expansive gospel. But I do not believe that its early composition date was its only point towards its authoritative claim. Rather, if we account for church tradition, both Eusebius, a Christian historian of the 3rd century, and Polycarp, a church father of the late 1st century, they both attribute Mark to be the interpreter of Peter, and that his gospel was largely informed by the witness of St. Peter himself. Perhaps the authority of the Gospel of Mark in the eyes of Matthew and Luke can be more correctly understood by an extension of Peter's authority, truly reflecting the words of Jesus in Matthew 16, verses 18 through 19. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Thank you for watching. I will be extending this video into a discussion of Q, the second part to the two-document hypothesis, soon enough. So stay tuned for that, and if you enjoyed this video, please take a look at my channel for more content like this.